north of Auckland. And I guess it's a real privilege, well, to be able to present and talk about our research to you all that we've done down there. It has been a privilege to come down and work in that part of the country. So thanks everybody for tuning in. I just want to quickly start by just acknowledging my co-authors or co-workers on this project. Dallas Lafont, who's just completed her PhD on this research, and Kelsey Miller and Caitlin Blaine, also from the University of Auckland, who've been doing this research with me, and Robin Dunmore from SLR Consulting, based down in Nelson. So this has been a project that's been going on for 4 or 5 years and has involved, I haven't actually shared my screen yet, have I? Good. Can you see the screen all right? Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah.
Okay. So this project we've had a huge amount of support. It's been amazing to come down to this part of the country and have support from everybody. Te Atiawa obviously have been a huge part of the project along the way. And we've also had support from Te Tauihu Fisheries Forum. This work was originally carried out as part of a National Sciences Challenge Sustainable Seas project for the first couple of years. But Port Marlborough have enabled us to continue this research for the last 2 years with their generous support. We've also had support along the way from Marlborough District Council and SLR Consulting, who Robin here works for, and some of the locals on the ground, Ben, Nathan and James, who have been, they've been going out on their dive boat, and Stuart, Kate and Whitney at Waikawa Dive. So thanks to everybody involved. So what have we been doing? So our research focuses on rocky reefs. So the underwater reefs, which are actually really extensive throughout Tōtaranui or Queen Charlotte Sound. A lot of the red margin you can see all the way around the sound is rock, hard rocky reef that then gives way into sort of sandy or shingly areas. So those reefs areas historically supported extensive seaweed forests or Rimurimu forests. And you can look back at historical aerial imagery. Like this is the south side of Ship Cove here. And that dark margin really outlines the subtidal reefs, the underwater reefs that were dominated by seaweeds. If we look at more recent imagery, it's really hard to make out that dark margin. There's just the smallest little areas right up and shallow. And those reefs are now predominantly covered in sea urchins. So the large seaweeds are gone from a lot of those reefs. So we're interested in trying to understand what's caused this change and how we go about reversing it. As far as the causes go, I guess there's 3 big impacts that we know the most about, or we talk about the most in the Marlborough Sound. The runoff from changes in land use from different land practices, sediment runoff. It's not too bad in Queen Charlotte Sound as compared to some of the other sounds. Obviously, overexploitation through fishing, particularly of Kina or sea urchin predators, and then more recently, climate change. So generally, the loss of kelp is thought to be due to some combination of those different factors. So when we have a healthy reef dominated by seaweeds, predators are abundant. There's lots of other species associated, including other species that we like to eat. So we consider a sort of healthy reef to support lots of the things we like to eat, but it also provides lots of other ecosystem services that we as humans benefit from. However, with this change to more of a barren reef, There might be a high abundance of Kina, but they're generally small and skinny. They're not good to eat. It has impacts on other fisheries such as paua. Paua are small as well. And you lose a lot of the biodiversity and ecosystem services. So we're really trying to figure out how we can restore these ecosystems. How can we restore these ecosystems? So what are the key factors driving the loss? What's preventing kelps and seaweeds from recovering? And how do we go about restoring them? So as a starting point for this project, we really wanted to go in and have a sort of large-scale look at the state of reefs across Tōtaranui. So we did a drop camera survey at about 100 sites across the Sound and into at least the western end of Tory Channel. I guess what we found is that there were still areas of decent kelp forests, such as in Tory Channel. There's still, you'll see it, on the surface, the giant kelp forests reaching up to the surface. But there's lots of areas where there's good. A lot of our seaweeds obviously don't make it up to the surface. They form these subsurface canopies, sort of a metre or so off the bottom. And areas such as in the outer parts of Tōtaranui and Tory Channel, there was still reasonable forests of seaweeds. But what was really striking is that over half of the reef area that we looked at was classified as Kina barrens. So these are areas where there's very little seaweed on the reef. It doesn't look like there's anything there for the Kina to eat, which is why they're generally small and skinny. But they can quite happily survive in those environments, just feeding on whatever seaweed might drift by or by scraping off whatever's growing on the rocks. So Dallas, as part of her PhD, analysed this data and looked at how the sort of amount of urchin barrens or seaweeds varied in relation to a number of factors, including wave exposure, turbidity, temperature, and Kina. And it really shone through that the Kina were, perhaps not surprising, the sort of main factor explaining where kelp was occurring in the Sounds. So as I said, lots of the reefs look like this, where the Kina are grazing right up to sort of a metre or so below the surface. And so there's just this little narrow band of seaweeds where the Kina either can't get to it or there's enough wave action to keep the Kina down. You'll notice there's a small sort of paua in here. So these Kina are coming right up into habitats where, the paua would once have been more common as well. This is just then an aerial shot of a drone shot of, this is actually the south side of Ship Cove. So one of those areas where the reef used to all be covered in seaweeds. And this is just the sort of shallow little patches of seaweed that remains. And all this area out here is the urchin barren, the white coloured rock. So I guess the big question is whether the Rimurimu can be restored to these barren reefs. And there was two parts to this really. One was understanding if removal of this Kina allowed for the natural recovery of the seaweeds. And secondly, or sort of part of this as well, is whether the current environmental conditions are actually favourable still for seaweeds, or has the environment changed to a point where seaweeds won't actually grow here in a lot of these places anymore. So to investigate this, we carried out a fairly large Kina removal experiment, where we were able to remove sea urchins from 4 sites located across Tōtaranui, and the idea was to cover a range of conditions where these barrens occurred, so we could look at how the recovery varied across different environmental conditions. So these red areas sort of outline where the Kina were removed from, and the idea was to try to find some discrete areas where we could remove the Kina, and then we monitor what's happening in the removal area with the surrounding barrens. You can see sort of this gradient. There's very, very low levels of seaweeds remaining in the inner part of the Sound, whereas out at Motuara Island, there was still a reasonable band of shallow that shallow dark margin you can see there, and then below that the Kina barrens extended out to the edge of the reef. So we've got this kind of gradient of conditions. So these are reasonably large areas, sort of 60 to 100 meters of coast extending out to the reef edge, which was normally about 40 meters offshore, about 10 meters deep. And the idea was to remove all of the Kina, as many as, well, that were visible, systematically across this area. Work that we've done in northern New Zealand has shown that if you leave too many Kina in these areas, the seaweeds won't come back. So you have to really reduce the Kina numbers to very low levels to give the seaweeds a chance to recover. So the Kina were removed in May 2022. Between about 7,000 and 10,000 Kina were removed from each site. And for the purposes of this experiment, we had a special permit from MPI, and through with consultation with Te Atiawa and Te Ihu Fisheries Forum, we had permission to cull the Kina within those removal areas because it was the most efficient way to do it systematically. Remembering that the Kina in these areas are also generally poor condition and small, so we're not really wasting a food resource. So I guess the problem we have is with these areas only being about 60 to 100 meters of coast, you've got Kina at each end, and the Kina will just move into these areas. So what we've been had to do is go back every 3 months, and this Marlborough District Council have helped us with this, and gone in and removed the Kina that are spilling back into these removal areas, just so that we can maximize the chance of seaweed recovery by keeping the Kina numbers low in those removal areas. So this was done in May 2022. We did initial surveys, and then we've carried out 6 monthly surveys through till November last year, and we'll have a 3-year survey this coming up in May. All right, this is just an example of what the reefs look like where we've been doing the surveys. So has the Rimurimu forest recovered? The answer is yes, and really quite to an amazing extent in some places, but we've seen quite variable recovery across the sites, which we expected to some extent. But in general, at all sites, we've seen a positive sign of Kina removal. So just sort of working from the inner part of the sound out, you'll see, so this is canopy cover. So if you're looking down on the reef, it's the amount of the reef that's covered by large seaweeds. And the green is in the removal area, and the orange is the controls. And so so I see there's questions popping up. I think we're just going to look at them at the end. Te Ihu Fisheries Forum. Sorry, I pronounced that wrong. So through it, yeah. So and then as we effectively Blackwood here, there is a positive response, but not very large. But then as we move further out into the outer part of the sound, we're seeing larger and larger effects. So with a very large increase at Motuara Island in algal canopy cover. And these patterns have continued through. This is just showing the data up to 2 years, but our latest data from from November last year showed an even greater recovery, where almost all of the reef in the Motuara removal area is now covered in seaweeds. So I'm just going to go through each of the different areas now to sort of show some examples of what these reefs look like. This is what Tahuhua, Blackwood Bay looked like before the removal. Very bare, and as I said, there was very few seaweeds in this entire removal area. What we've seen is within the shallow zone, there's been a huge increase in lots of little small seaweeds, cystophorus. This is a native Kōura geminata. So right up in the sort of 1 to 2 meter zone, we've seen a really big increase in seaweeds. And then associated with that, there's lots of small reef fish like triple fins here in Pakiti or spotty, and lots of small seaweeds in amongst that area. And a real highlight for us last November when we went and visited, when we did the surveys, was this aggregation of pipefish in the seaweeds at the removal site. So we hadn't seen pipefish there previously, as there was very little seaweed, and there were just, I won't say hundreds, but tens of these pipefish. So there's a picture of Robin here. I think there's about 6 or 7 in the photo, if you can spot them all. So that was a bit of a highlight to see those. But deeper down on the reef, we haven't seen much recovery of the seaweeds, at least yet. So we don't know if that's something that's just going to take more time to occur, or whether just this deeper environment in the inner part of the sound is not really ideal for seaweeds. Maybe there's never been seaweeds down on these reefs. We did transplant 2 species of kelp and some other seaweeds into this site. The kelps didn't survive, we think because it's just too low water motion, and probably quite warm summer temperatures as the inner sound heats up. But we did get survival of some of the carpophyllum that we transplanted into the site. So there is potential for some seaweed recovery on these deeper reefs. We just haven't seen it yet. As we move out into the outer part of the sound, as I said, we're seeing much higher rates of recovery of seaweed. Effectively, this shallow band of carpophyllum mashlocarpum is extending deeper. So this is the same, exactly the same spot on the reef 2 years later. And so this carpophyllum is recruited and extending further down. And just as an example, these are sort of doing the shallow quadrats at this site. They were very easy in 2022 with it just being Kina, whereas now we've got really high densities of carpophyllum and lots of other stuff living in amongst it. So other seaweeds, smaller seaweeds, and invertebrates. Yeah. And here's unfortunately a blurry photo of the seahorse, which is the best you can do with a GoPro with small things. But there was a seahorse in the removal area at Blue Mine, which was cool to see. I've been seen there a few times. So as well as bringing back the seaweeds, you're starting to see other species coming back associated with it. Deeper down on the reef at Blue Mine, we have seen less recovery, but we are getting carpophyllum flexuosum coming in, and this was at the 2-year mark. 2.5 years, we've got sort of up to 2 meter high plants of carpophyllum flexuosum. Now, again, at that particular site, we haven't had any kelp recruitment. So the main kelp species are the giant kelp, Macrocystis, and Eclonia. So we haven't had any natural recruitment at that site, whereas out at Ship Cove, we've had some. So Ship Cove has really had a really extensive increase in mainly carpophyllum flexuosum cover. And here's one of the recruits of Eclonia. So some little recruits are naturally coming into this area. We don't know where they're coming from because there isn't Eclonia that nearby. There's some Eclonia out at the obviously at Motuara Island, so it suggests the spores are probably coming from further away than we would expect. And we've also had giant kelp recruitment into the removal area at Ship Cove. Now, the problem with this is when you get some nice tasty little kelp recruits popping up on these reefs, they're a real target for any herbivorous fish that are in the area. So so far, these juveniles haven't survived because they've been eaten by fish. So that's something we'll have to keep following. But we're seeing lots of other species in amongst the seaweeds that are growing back, including, snails and little baby crayfish tucked away, both yellowfoot and blackfoot paua. There's some squid eggs on some of the seaweeds. Oh, and there's our seahorse friend again. I can't remember which side it was from. Sorry, it was one of these ones. So the biggest amount of recovery we've had has been at Motuara Island, out in the outermost part of the sound. For people familiar with Motuara, there's a lot of kelp and giant kelp on the northern end of it, but as you come back towards the southern end, there wasn't, at least when we did the initial clearances, and there was a lot of barren there. So we've seen really rapid recovery. Oh, sorry, this is the removal area. Before removal in 2022, there was sort of some fringing carpophyllum seaweeds, and then quite a bit of undaria, so the invasive Japanese kelp in that removal area. But effectively what's happened is the whole reef is really filled in with large seaweeds now, large native seaweeds. So both the kelp species, Aclonia radiata and macrocystis, the giant kelp, as well as lots of the carpophyllums. We now have a sort of a 2 to 3 meter tall forest of carpophyllum with macrocystis, and also large sargassum plants as well. Some of these plants are up to 4 to 5 meters tall. So all of this is just naturally colonized in the area once the Kina were removed. Just go to I've got a video. This was taken in November last year, so at the 2.5 year mark, up in about 2 or 3 meters of water, an area that was completely barren in 2022. And this is just showing you how thick the seaweeds are, and also all the different fish that are now associated with those seaweeds. So it's a pretty dramatic change to what was there previously. And just to sort of show this, we can actually see this change from space. Here's a satellite image from Google Earth from April 2022. And you can see there's just those dark patches up in shallow, and the light color, it's a bit murky, but the light color is the barren. And you can see it in this more recent image from December 2023, all the barren still in the surrounding areas. But within the removal area, you can actually make out the giant kelp plants in the dark coloration. So as I mentioned, that area now is just completely filled in with kelp, and we're actually seeing some of that kelp spill over into the surrounding areas. You can sort of see that here. So in summary, these results have clearly demonstrated that Kina are a major factor preventing the Rimurimu recovery in the sound. But it's also, the Kina are also important, having a major impact in reducing the resilience of these forests to other stresses. So if we have a marine heat wave and the kelp all dies off and the reef's covered in Kina, it's going to be very hard for it to recover. Whereas what we've actually seen with the recovery in these removal areas is some of that recovery happened during some really big marine heat waves in 2023. So the removal of the Kina actually is increasing the resilience of those kelp forests. The really positive thing, I think, as well, is that it shows that there is this natural capacity and high capacity for recovery on these reefs. So it isn't the fact that the environment's so degraded that seaweeds can't grow there anymore. But if we can control the urchin numbers, then it at least gives the seaweeds a better chance. So it all points towards Kina removal being able to provide a valuable tool for restoration, for promoting and accelerating recovery of kelp. But there are major buts with this, right? It's like the main thing being is that Kina removal is not really a long-term solution. I mean, we'd have to keep going back forever, removing Kina out of these sites, and they'll keep coming back. And there is also, as you saw from some of the early results I showed, more than half of the sound is a Kina barren. So there's literally millions of Kina throughout the sound. So really we need to help nature control the Kina, and that the main way to do that is to restore the natural predators of Kina, which can be achieved through either protection, well, very effectively through protection, but also through improving and increasing our fisheries restrictions. So what happens, where are the reef predators? When we think about the Marlborough Sounds, I guess we think about blue cod, maybe crayfish, but actually snapper used to be very important in, were likely very important in the Marlborough Sounds as well. So this is a photo from the 50s from Double Cove, which was a guy that you guys probably know the story better than me, a lot of you will, basically tamed these snapper. And so that's the reason why, part of the reason I understand why Double Cove is protected from fishing. So historically, these predators were much more abundant. And at the moment, we only have, well, there's Double Cove, but also Long Island, Kakumahua, Marine Reserve, which is completely protected from fishing. So these two photos, the bottom right here, are taken in the Marine Reserve. There's large kōura crayfish as well as blue cod there, which are important predators of the sea urchins. It's only a relatively small marine reserve. I don't think it extends very far offshore. But what we found is that the extent of Kina barrens was considerably lower in the marine reserve compared to the surrounding coast. So clearly protecting these predators, allowing them to recover and help control the urchins is an important part of the solution, perhaps as well as then controlling the urchins through some active removal program or harvest. I guess the final point I want to make really is that it's not just, there aren't any single simple solutions. And I think really if you want to restore the health of the reef ecosystems, but also Tōtaranui more broadly, then obviously we're going to need a more multi-pronged and integrative approach. So that's really it. I just want to say a final thank you to all the many people we've had involved, and we've tried hard to get people out on the water from Te Atiawa, from the council, from the port. Also, we've had Marlborough Girls College out there getting so they could see some of the mahi and some of the results. And yeah, thanks to everyone that's been involved and helped out. Cheers. I have to now, I think I look at the questions, right? So if you've got questions, you can put them in the chat. I'll just go back to the start. I'm just quickly scanning through the questions. Yeah, obviously the second time I said Te Tohu, I pronounced it wrong, so sorry about that. Yeah, I'm more than happy to present this at the to the fisheries forum. So I'm happy to do that, Tracy. So is there a scope for a citizen science project to support this work? One of the winners of Marlborough School Science Fair, Alka Stafford, has been doing some great work surveying the kelp beds. Yeah, there's definitely scope for citizen science projects, and there's a number of projects popping up around the country doing some great work. We have been working, Kelsey Miller, who's been involved in all of this work, is working on a guidebook which communities can use to help sort of guide how the Kina removal could be done. But yeah, there's definitely scope for that. Tracy's asking, prior to this study, was there a baseline study on the quantity of Kina? As we refer to it as kelp barrens and not Kina barrens. Yeah, kelp barrens is a much more sensible word because it's barren of kelp, and it's certainly not barren. They're not barren of Kina, and I've heard that suggested. But globally, the norm has been urchin barren, and it's been turned to Kina barren for obvious reasons here. The surveys that I presented sort of were at least well, we could consider it a baseline from 2018, showing the extent of barrens and where the kelp. But I did surveys in the Sounds in the early 2000s, and there was plenty of Kina barren there, or shall we say kelp barrens then as well. This is weird with me only being the only one doing the talking. Rose is asking, it's great, yeah, great to show these results, Rose, after talking with you about this all at the early stages of the project. What are the plans for the next steps? So the project has gone on obviously longer than it was ever intended to, thanks to Port Marlborough keeping it going. There is a huge amount of interest, and I think this shows the potential of what can be done. We, at a small scale level, I guess we are keen to keep these sites going and see what the further succession of the forests look like. And so we want to do another survey in May, which will be the 3-year mark. But I guess the next steps really, I think, is looking across the Sound in terms of what could be done to restore things on a bigger scale. You know, what's needed to not just bring back the kelp, but bring back the predators, you know, the other, thinking about the system as a whole. And, you know, there's some big questions and big projects to be, you know, sort of developed around that. Is there currently a management vehicle for an integrated approach? No, as far as I know. There's been, or an effective forum. No, we have some people on the line, I think, from Fisheries New Zealand. Yeah, and Kina barrens now recognised to have been a result of fishing predators. So Fisheries New Zealand are increasingly working in this space in terms of trying to figure out solutions around how they might mitigate or reverse some of the urchin barrens. Up in the northern parts of New Zealand, there's a lot of work going on what that might look like. But I think, you know, an ecosystem-based approach, which is now normally an area-based approach, is the way to go. The Marlborough Sounds, you know, whether it's done for specific sounds or across the Sound, I think, you know, there's a bunch of conversations need to be had, and people need to figure out the best way to do it.
Thanks so much, Nick, for your really insightful presentation. I see we've got another question. If anyone has any sort of questions after the webinar and or would like to know more information, please just email through to the email that you received the link for this webinar at, I think it's communications@pmnz.co.nz.
The last question there was from Nicole, who's run a project in Wellington Harbour, I'm pretty sure, and similar results where once the Kina are removed, the seaweeds naturally recolonize. And we've carried out a number of these experiments now throughout from the Marlborough Sounds, but also in northern New Zealand, and generally we see natural recovery of seaweeds. So it's a pretty simple and relatively cheap restoration approach in terms of removing sea urchins and seeing kelp recovery. The challenge is figuring out how do we restore the whole ecosystem so that we can have longer term, more resilient kelp forests. And some of our marine reserves provide good examples of how that might work.
Awesome. Thanks. Thanks so much, Nick, for the presentation. Any further questions, like I said, just flick it through to communications@pmnz.co.nz. And we'll close the webinar. Jeremy, Skip, they've asked if you would just close with the karakia. Cool, I'll just unmute you.
Yeah.
We can hear you.
Okay. Kia ora, Nick. That was awesome webinar. Thanks once again, and look forward to carrying this on and keeping in touch with it. Moreira, kia ora kei te katoa. Tātai karakia whakamutu nā. Tā whiri mai nā hua te tai ao mai a papatūnu koe takoto nei. Kia rangi nui e tu iho nei. Tu tiri whiti whakamaua kia tīnā, uie, tai. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Jimmy.
everyone.
And thanks, everyone, for joining.
Quite interesting, eh?